right, the slope. It says slope, yeah.
So slope, rate of change. And we talked about that earlier in the unit. Independent variable really is talking about our x values. It's the horizontal axis. And the input, thank you. And the input. The things that you plug in and see what happens. Those are independent variables. Dependent variables, stop being bored already, are the y values. Generally the vertical axis. And it's our output. Our domain really is also referring back to our independent variables. So in other words, these are our possible x values, and they should be logical, meaning if you're talking about how many tickets can you sell, you shouldn't say negative 25. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. Likewise, then, your range is referring to your dependent stuff, or in other words, your y values, the possible ones. And just like the domain, these should be logical. Questions so far on any of our vocabulary? Some refreshers. On slope. We've talked about it as the rise or the run. Sometimes we say this means the change in y, that's what the little triangle means, over the change in x. The formula that we've used in the past, and probably you see all the time in mathematics, is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, which is really just saying, look at the y value from the second point, take away the y value from the first point, look at the x value from the second point, take away the x value from the first point. Divide them, that's your slope. Oftentimes we use the letter m to designate slope. That's not required. That's not true in every case. Our calculator actually does not use the letter m. It'll use a or b if you're trying to do a regression line. And then the last thing before we get started on some samples here is what is an intercept. I think when you're talking about the intercept form of a line, one of the things that's kind of important to note is that we usually write down the equation of our line as y equals mx plus b. And this m thing, this is our slope. And this b thing, this is our y-intercept. Sometimes they like to write this same exact line as y equals a plus bx. This is one of the ways it's written in our calculator. In that case, if they do it that way, then this thing, this a, is the y-intercept, and this b is the slope. And so what you'll notice is whatever's immediately preceding the x, that's your slope. Whatever is not immediately preceding the x, that's your y-intercept. What happens if you don't see anything in front of the x and you just see something like y equals 3 plus x? What's the slope? 1. They don't write the 1 there. They assume that you know it. So don't forget that if you don't see a number in front of the x, they're talking about 1. That's kind of the deal. questions on slope-intercept form. This is the phrase for slope, or sorry, these are the equations that you often see for slope-intercept form. Now, one of the nice things about this class is we have a lot of practical applications that occur. And so what you'll see is, like, for example here, we're talking about a car. Pretty much everybody drives by the time they're 20 years old and has a car and has to get around to either go to work or something. And so it's kind of important, especially today when you see the gas prices are about $4 a gallon, to kind of know like how many gallons you have in your gas tank, what's your gas mileage, that kind of thing. So this one's talking about something like that. This one's saying that your car holds 12 gallons of gas and you're going to start with a full tank. So this is pretty common for an economy-sized car, something like a Toyota Corolla, Ford Focus, something like that. And you get 32 miles per gallon, which is pretty good. And you're interested in knowing how much gas you have left in the gas tank. How much gas you have left in the gas tank. So let's talk about the independent and the dependent variable. Okay, so if you're looking for how much gas, whatever it is that you're looking for, that's the dependent variable. So dependent is what you're looking for. And in this case, because they say, I'm interested in how much gas I have left, this is the gasoline in this case. The independent variable is whatever you're going to shove into your equation when you have one to find the information that you're looking for. So it's the other thing that they talk about. And in this case, the other thing that they're talking about for the independent variable is going to be this is what you're going to plug in. If we're not talking about gas, we're talking about miles. So you have how many miles did you drive and how much gas did you use. Don't forget the independent variable. This is talking about x. And your dependent variable, this is talking about y. We just talked about this so previously in the vocabulary and in the equations. Now, I don't know about you guys, but whenever I think about driving, I always think about the phrase miles per gallon. That's what I think about. So I notice up above that they talk about I get 32 miles per gallon. And if you're going to write this down as a fraction, you would write down 32 miles per gallon. And that's per 1 gallon. But they don't ask that in this particular question in part B. They ask it the other way around. So you have to be careful when you're reading these things. They don't say how many miles per gallon do I get. They say how much gas per each mile do I use. So the gas per mile is the exact flip of this. So if you know how to say it in one way, all you need if they're asking the other question is you just flip it upside down. So what they're really saying here is that I know that I use 1/32 gallon per mile. So the words are the label, and the fraction is talking about in which order. So if I was putting in how many miles I went and I wanted gallons, that would be the miles per gallon. If I'm talking about how much I'm using, that's different. I use 1/32 gallon for every mile. So if miles are my input, then I use 1/32 of a gallon. Okay, and that's kind of important in the next question, because the next question says, let's write it in an intercept form, which we talked about up above, to model the amount of gas in the tank. So you're looking for gasoline. That means that gasoline is the dependent variable. Gasoline. Okay, so I know that normally what I write is y equals mx plus b. And gasoline is my dependent variable. So from above, this was the blue stuff. And if gasoline is what I'm looking for, that means that miles, the amount of miles that I travel, is the independent variable, or what I would plug in. So that would be the purple stuff from up above. So if I'm plugging that in, I need to use the orange gallons per mile in order to talk about my slope. And then I also need to know that I start out with how many gallons. So as I rewrite this thing, I know that what I'm going to say is the number of gallons in my tank will start out with 12. That's how many gallons I have in my tank right now. And as you drive, do the amount of gallons go up or go down? They go down. You use gasoline. So I'm going to reduce, which means taking away 1/32 of a gallon for every mile that I travel. So the 12 is representing how many gallons you start with. The minus is saying I'm going down in gasoline, and I go down 1/32 of a gallon for every mile that I drive. And the x is representing the number of miles. Remember, that's the independent variable. So this next part of the same question is saying, okay, well then how much gas do I have when I drove 150 miles? So the amount of gas that you're talking about here is talking about the y value. That's how much gas will be left in your tank. I don't know yet. But I know that that's going to be equal to the 12 gallons that I started out with, take away 1/32 of a gallon, and now you're going to be talking about you drove a certain amount of miles. How many miles did they drive? 150. So I shove in the 150, and I type this into my calculator, and I see how much gallons of gas I'll have left over. Now when you do this, I'm going to tell you in your calculator, even though it doesn't show it on the board, your calculator has a specific way they like to have things typed in. In your calculator, you should put this stuff that's a fraction in a parentheses. Whenever you see fractions, use parentheses in your calculator. And your answer will be in gallons of gas when you're finished. So 12 minus parentheses 1 divided by 32 parentheses times 150. 7.31. Thank you. 7.31 gallons to the nearest 2 decimal places. So really when you think about this, if it's a 12-gallon tank, you still haven't even used half of your tank yet. Because remember, that'd be 6, and you still have over that. So you can go over 300 miles in your car, which is kind of a nice deal. Notice how this one says how much gas will I have. So gas was the Y stuff, miles were the X stuff. In part E it says, how far can you travel before there's only 1 gallon left? Now the 1 gallon left is talking about the very end. When you're finished, you're talking about 1 gallon.